So, I've been tuning in intermittently to this exchange between TBS and Epidemic, and if you haven't seen Epidemic 2020's videos, I recommend him. He's pretty sharp, he seems to be well-read and sincere and fairly polite and respectable, even if his list of reputable atheists omits my august name, a little shit. I should apologize in advance if some of this has been covered in someone else's videos or in the comment war that has savagely raged beneath their recent videos, but I've seen a number of problems in his videos, and maybe they've been resolved, but I felt like articulating them. Some of the points I address here aren't exactly rebuttals per se, because he hasn't actually elaborated on some of these ideas very much. And I'll try to be clear about when I'm merely announcing that sort of preemptive concern. Some points I think are just things that I think are missing. So, anyways, the first thing I have a problem with is this whole discussion of God's essential nature and its relationship to the moral sense we all purportedly possess. One thing I never hear explained is, what does it mean for morality to reflect God's nature? I've never heard that parsed. It doesn't just mean God objects to X, because if that's all it meant, we're confronted with the Euthyphro dilemma again, which is precisely what his essential nature has been invoked to defeat. And whatever it does mean, if God has an essential nature, then what else can that mean than that he is subject to the limitations of his own nature, and that his moral nature is beyond his command? And then it seems to be confronted by the Euthyphro dilemma again. So what does it mean? Because this whole God's essential nature thing is kind of being trotted out like an 18-hand horse on the last day of the fair, and I'm not too fucking impressed, to be perfectly honest. I mean, am I just supposed to know what that means through the eye of my innate moral sense? The second, and I feel catastrophic problem with this claim, is the bare assertion that whatever the relationship between God's nature and morality may be, the moral aspect of his nature is somehow essential. Why should I think that? This bears some elaboration. The essence of X is that which X cannot do without and still be X. The essence of X is both sufficient and necessary for a thing to be X. It's all it has to have, and nothing more is required. A shape is not a circle if it is not the locus of points in a plane equidistant to a given point. That is the essence of a circle. A shape is not a sphere if it is not the locus of points in a three-dimensional space equidistant to a given point. And God, as we all know, is the creator of heavens and the earth. If he is not, then he is not God. I think we will be hard-pressed to find a theist who disputes this concept of God's essential nature. The trouble is, you don't just get to tack on, and for no fucking reason I'd like to point out, that he also happens to be constitutionally opposed through some ineffable relationship to things like rape. Because I can just as easily conceive of a universe created by God in which rape is not incommensurate with his nature. And I can do this because God's moral nature is no more essential than the location of the center of the circle is to the circle's nature. You can have circles all over the place. You can have big ones and small ones, red ones and blue ones, angry gods, happy gods, sneezy gods, and sleepy gods. I suppose you could just decline to discuss malevolent gods, but as I say, you do it for no reason, because there is no logical impossibility inherent in the notion that a malicious god could have created the universe. Since his most important trait, his role as creator, is entirely disconnected from his moral nature. Moreover, as this is all about a defense of moral realism, it would seem to make your argument rest upon at least one bare assertion. So while the explanation of the relationship between God's nature and our moral sense is as yet unknown to me, I anticipate this serious problem when it comes. The other problem I have with Epidemic's video is that, as is common, it seems to talk right past Scott's video. And admittedly, Scott's rather talks past his. This is a problem with conversations about ethics, and not really either presenter's fault. But I do have some criticism, surprise, of how he discusses ethics. Chiefly, his treatment of values and the word ought. He seems to treat them as though they're two unrelated ideas. He asks, what ought I value? With my understanding of ethics, this is gibberish, though. I will forego a discussion of intrinsic value, by the way, because I think TBS has pretty neatly done away with that already. On my view, when you say Joe ought to X, you're actually making a conditional statement. You're saying, if Joe values Y, he ought to X. Now, Y can be anything down to and including X itself, if X happens to be a verb. That is, if Joe values taking a walk, then Joe ought to take a walk. But prescriptions are more often than not more instrumental than that. Take, for example, if Joe values his own welfare, he ought to get a job. It's a more complicated a proposition, but when you unpack it, you are saying that getting a job is the logical entailment of the facts of the world and a person's desire to eat good food, sleep under a roof, etc. So back to what Epidemic said. What does it mean to say that a person ought to value something? Well, the closest thing I can come up with is that we are merely pointing to an entailment which might not, perhaps, be obvious. For instance, if a person values self-determination, then by extension he ought to value human life to some degree. But this isn't what he intends. He wants to suggest that we ought to value a thing because we are obliged to do so. God is the obligator, or obligator, as I like to call him, and we are the obliged. Now, I think that there are three ways to make sense of an obligation, two of which rely on values as I conceive them, and therefore have no need of a moral realist framework being entirely bound up in the subject's values, and a third which is meaningless. The first is the most familiar approach to obligation. We owe God a debt for what he has given us, life, the universe, everything. Forgoing the objection raised by the totality of human suffering, I'll just point out that this explanation still relies on a preceding value. Do I value the payment of my debts? Even debt itself, under this explanation, seems to rely on a subjective value. Do I prefer to compensate those who give me things I desire? The second, we owe God, and if we don't pay, he'll punish us. Now, this is obligation in the feudal sense. God is the Lord and we are his serfs. But this relies on our preference to avoid our own suffering, which is a value we possess or don't. So this is actually just a form of coercion and not consistent with a moral realist framework. To elaborate, I know of no way to compel a person to value a thing. I suspect that there is no such way. I know of lots of ways to coerce a person, though, so that he'll respect a thing that others value. But that doesn't mean they value it themselves. If a man wants to commit murder, for example, we can compel him to act as though he doesn't want to commit murder, by playing upon some other value of his. By threatening to harm a would-be murderer, we can compel him to not commit murder. That we have brought his value for self-preservation into play doesn't mean that we've removed his desire to commit murder. So we've treated a symptom, not the cause. This is more or less the substance of my response to his video, Psychopaths and Morality, by the way. That a man can be coerced or indoctrinated to yield to cultural norms doesn't mean his values are the same as ours. To use an analogy he himself introduced, the fact that you can convince a blind man to say that the sky is blue doesn't mean he understands what he's saying when he does, or even that he agrees in the strictest sense. But I don't think this is what he means. I think he means this obligation in some sense which is actually quite alien, because the obligation exists without our consent, and not just without our consent, but in fact before our consent. This obligation is imposed on us whether we know it or not, and we have no choice in the matter. That's not to say we don't have the choice to abandon our duty. It's only to say that, abandon it or not, the duty is there. We simply owe God, and that's that. End of discussion. You're obligated, and that's all. But this kind of obligation is as meaningless as saying you owe the heir half your tater tots. What? Why do I owe? Why do I owe that? For what? And who says? Now the third, or is it the fourth, thing I take issue with is I gather that he would like to point to our evolutionary heritage in defense of moral realism. And I can understand why. It seems obvious that our evolutionary background has left us, as a species, predisposed to certain behaviors. The trouble is that our evolutionary heritage is simply one of billions of possible evolutionary avenues, which start with one of billions of possible evolutionary origins, which took place at one of billions of possible moments in one of billions of possible locations in one of an infinite set of possible worlds. And yet he maintains that, regardless of the conditions of our ancestry, regardless of time and place, that when any creature ascends from the mire of his unrefined evolutionary origins and attains agency and intelligence enough to reflect on the nature of his own acts, that he cannot possibly do so with any moral sense different from our own. That despite near infinite possible conditions and environmental factors, the same basic rules of behavior will be found without exception, and not just implemented generally, collectively, but found somewhere in every thinking organ, every brain. Now, I don't deny that we generally tend to have certain inclinations and that they are best explained by our evolutionary heritage, but to turn from that and call it universal strikes me as a gross misunderstanding of the very evidence called to task. It seems even sillier to me to suggest that evolution is the link between some objective moral standard found in God's nature, apparently, and our understanding of it. So, to recap, 1. God's moral nature is not an essential part of his nature, and God could easily be of malevolent or neutral moral constitution, meaning the Euthyphro dilemma hasn't been solved, still applies, and is a beautiful intellectual trinket, still sitting on my mantle. 2. If God's essential nature is, inexplicably, not arbitrary, and could not have been otherwise, then it is not subject to his will, and is, therefore, a limitation on even him, meaning he is not the source of morality as it is imposed on him as fully as it would be on us, meaning the dilemma holds. 3. 1 and 2 notwithstanding, God's moral nature is, as far as I can tell, completely irrelevant to any debate over the possibility of moral realism, as his nature seems quite independent of what humans ought to do or ought not do, and no link between the two seems to be on offer from those espousing this ethical theory. 4. Our evolutionary heritage seems a sufficient cause and adequate explanation for the loose consistency of moral systems and predispositions we find in the cultures and individuals throughout the world and its history. This doesn't make morality objective and certainly not universal. It just makes certain prescriptions popular among humans. 5. Any discussion of moral obligations seems to rest either on the boldest of bare assertions, the threat of torment for failure to answer a capricious duty imposed by a deity of dubious character, or a larger, more inclusive ethical theory as yet unexplored, at least unexplored by epidemic.